I walked into the glass conference room on the 14th floor with steady, measured footsteps, the same rhythm I have kept for more than 30 years in this line of work. I am no stranger to emergency meetings. Usually they happen when someone forgets to schedule the night shift trucks or when the barcode scanners decide to stage a small rebellion. But today the air felt thinner, stretched tight like paper pulled too far. I could tell the moment I saw the two men at the head of the table, neither of whom bothered to stand. It was the kind of atmosphere people create when the decision is already made, and they are just waiting for you to show up so they can complete the ritual. On the left was Hadley Pierce, the youngest chief financial officer this company has ever hired, a man who seemed to believe spreadsheets understand human nature better than humans do. On the right sat Declan Ward, the newly appointed supply chain director, who, if we are being honest, still did not understand the difference between supply chain and regular freight. And between them was Linda from Human Resources, holding a stack of documents thicker than necessary, as if the weight of the paperwork could somehow add gravity to the situation. I pulled out a chair and sat, keeping my back straight. The three of them exchanged glances like students too nervous to decide who should speak first. Eventually, Hadley began, trying for formality, but unable to hide the slight tremor in his voice. I had heard that tone too many times. It always starts with "thanks for coming" and ends with the sentence no one wants to say aloud. Linda slid a sheet of paper toward me. On it was a grainy photo of me walking into the headquarters of Third Point Logistics the week before. The footage came from an old camera, the kind that makes everything look like a faded wartime snapshot. I studied it for a moment. In my youth, I truly believed technology would help people understand each other better. But here we were. This blurry, washed-out image, barely clear enough to tell whether it was me or any other man of the same height, was apparently all the evidence they needed to drag me into this room. They found proof from a camera blurrier than my memory on days I forget my keys. I did not say it out loud, but the thought wandered through my mind with a mix of dry humor and tired resignation. Linda started reading the accusation. "Mr. Thomas, we received information indicating you may be working two jobs at the same time. This violates your employment agreement and compromises the level of loyalty the company expects." Her voice was flat, the way someone reads step-by-step instructions for assembling cheap furniture. I stayed silent as Hadley picked up the line. "We were waiting to hear how you plan to explain this. You entered Third Point Logistics during work hours. This is not just a loyalty concern. It exposes us to legal risks if a competitor learns sensitive information." Declan pretended to, study the papers, flipping a page and adjusting his glasses like someone trying very hard to appear competent. Then he attempted to read a clause I knew he did not understand. According to Section 53 of the employment agreement, the employee is prohibited from participating in any labor activities within the industry of supply. He stumbled on the next word. It was obviously a supply chain. I had heard him call it a supply change in a meeting just last week. I waited, and right on cue, he tried again and stumbled again. The silence stretched just long enough for me to realize he had no idea how to fix the sentence. Hadley frowned at the awkward pause. He tried to recover, putting on the same moral duty expression I had seen too many times. "This is not easy for us, but we have to protect the integrity of the company. You understand that, do you not?" I looked at the three of them, then at the blurry photo lying neatly on the table. I thought about the 30 years I had put into this place, the nights I worked until the first light hit the warehouse windows, the winters I stood on the loading docks counting inventory to make sure hospitals received their equipment before the temperature dropped, the young operators I trained back when they still held barcode scanners like foreign objects. And then I realized that none of that mattered here. Not to them. To them, I was just one last box to check in a decision they had already made. I reached for the badge hanging at my collar. The nylon strap brushed against my shirt with a sound far too soft for the moment it marked. I set it on the table, neatly. Then I stood. My voice was quiet, like closing a door gently in the early morning so you do not wake anyone. "If this is your decision, I will not argue." They said nothing. I do not think they expected calm. Hadley attempted a polite smile but could not finish it. Declan stared at the table as if he could hide in the paperwork. Linda nodded awkwardly, as if even she was not sure when things had gone this far. I turned and walked out. Curious eyes lingered on me from the hallway, then flicked away. People always look like that when they see someone pushed outside the safety line, like watching an accident from a distance and pretending they did not see it. The elevator opened with a soft chime, a small punctuation mark. Inside, I caught my reflection in the mirror. More gray in my hair than last year, but my eyes were clearer than I expected. I was not sad. I was not angry. I felt lighter, as if someone had quietly lifted a sandbag off my shoulders. When I stepped outside, the Denver morning wind hit my face, cold but clean. I stood there for a moment. After 30 years, it was the first time I walked out of a workplace without feeling pressure waiting on the other side. It felt like I had slipped out of a sentence I did not know I had been serving for years. And before I go on, I want to ask you something because it has always made me curious. Before I tell you the rest of this story, where are you listening from? I have always wondered how far each person's path has traveled to end up here with me. I drove away from the company building, and only when I reached the highway did I realize I was heading east, toward the dirt roads of Ohio in my memory. Maybe my mind simply returned to where everything began, as if after 30 years of keeping systems running, the only thing still holding on to me was my own origin. I was born in a small town where winter arrived early and left late. My father was a defense transport driver, a man who worked in places the map showed only as pale gray spaces. He never said much about the job, but every time he came home, he placed his pocket watch on the kitchen table before he even sat down. I grew up with that steady ticking. It felt like a reminder that every system, simple or complex, survives only when it has a rhythm it can rely on. When he passed away, my mother handed me the watch and simply said my father believed I understood its meaning. I did not ask for more. Some things can only be understood by living with them, not by hearing them explained. That ticking followed me into the military when I was 18. I was assigned to a supply transport unit where every decision had to be fast and precise. There were no presentations to guide me on what to do. When the main road was blocked, or when a truck lost signal in the middle of the night, we learned by surviving. Those years trained me to see weak points before they turned into problems. When I left the service, I realized medical transport was where I could use those skills without having to step across a life and death line every day. I started at a small warehouse in Ohio, then moved to Colorado when the company expanded. The work was not glamorous, but I liked its quiet. I liked knowing that one well-timed decision could keep a hospital from delaying treatment. I still remember the blizzard in 1998. The main route shut down, and a truck carrying the supplies to a small medical center was stuck on the road. That night, I sat next to the radio, maps spread across the table like I was tracing veins on a body. When I found a small detour through a series of low hills, I guided the driver mile by mile. They arrived at 3 in the morning. No one acknowledged it except me and the medical center manager, who called back to thank me, her voice tired and relieved. Then came 2014 when the flu wave spread and hospitals ran short on equipment again. The allocation system was nearly overwhelmed. My team and I worked 3 days straight, adjusting every route, combining small orders so each hospital received at least the minimum amount. The reports later looked clean and polished, but no one knew how many people had stayed awake through the night so they would look that way. I worked like that for many years without expecting praise, but I believed experience counted for something. Then the company changed. The people who once stood with me on the loading docks at midnight either left or were moved elsewhere. In their place were young faces, well-dressed, carrying new buzzwords they learned in business school. They talked about modeling, optimization, and forecasting. I was not against new ideas, but I always knew forecasts could never replace realities these people had never touched. In recent meetings, what I said was often treated like a footnote. Once, I warned that cutting the backup driver pool would be dangerous if another outbreak returned. Hadley just looked at me and said the company needed to move toward the future, not return to the past. I remember his eyes then, confident and impatient. He believed in his spreadsheet as if it were a holy book. Another time, I reminded them that the western route needed inspection because the bridge was under repair. Declan nodded, wrote it down, and forgot it as soon as the meeting ended. A week later, the trucks were delayed 6 hours. He said the cause was the weather, not the bridge. I did not argue. Those conversations grew more frequent, and I realized I was no longer seen as a guide, but as someone repeating things they did not want to hear. I did not resent them. Resentment changes nothing, but I felt a kind of sorrow. Sorrow for the real-world experience they treated like outdated memories. Sorrow for the system we built with nights spent on cold asphalt. Sorrow for the years they could have learned from small mistakes instead of waiting for one big one to break everything. And this morning, when I placed my badge on the table and walked out of the building, I understood something with absolute clarity. In this place, they did not need to change the system. They only needed to remove me. Because my presence reminded them that not everything can be decided from a presentation slide. And sometimes that truth is uncomfortable enough that people choose to eliminate the person who carries it rather than accept it. As I drove toward the pale blue horizon, the ticking of my father's watch echoed in my mind, steady and slow. I knew he would not have been surprised by what happened today. He always believed that some systems stand only when the person who keeps their rhythm is respected. And I felt in each quiet tick that a new chapter of mine had begun the moment the conference room door closed behind me. I left the rest stop and drove a few more miles, not rushing and not searching for any destination. My mind was still drifting around what had happened that morning, but not because of the termination. I cared far less about being fired than about the one thing they had no idea about. If anyone in that conference room had understood the full context, they might have chosen a very different way to speak before placing that blurry photo on the table. More than 2 years ago, when the company started restructuring and cutting staff, I realized I could not depend on a system that trusted numbers but ignored people. Around that time, I met 3 young folks at an industry seminar in Nebraska. They talked about the work in a way I had not heard from any of the younger employees at my company in a long time. Grounded, direct, and focused on how the system actually operated in the real world. We stayed after the final session, and soon 3 others from small, local firms joined us. 6 people, each holding a different piece of the puzzle. I did not start a company, did not put up a sign, did not use any grand title. We simply formed an independent analysis group to study raw data, identify bottlenecks, and optimize transport routes. That was how the Nebraska group was born. They worked quietly but sharply. When the big outsourcing firms delivered models that looked impressive on paper, my group looked at the parts those firms never touched. That was why smaller contractors trusted us. They wanted to understand reality, not listen to polished promises. And gradually, our name spread. By early this year, Third Point Logistics signed a contract with the Nebraska group to analyze their operational model for the next transition phase. When I read the confirmation email, I had to sit down. After more than 30 years in this field, I thought I had seen every contradiction. But I never expected the day would come when my own employer would hire the very team I led to prepare for a transformation they themselves did not understand. The amusing part was that no one at the company knew. I did not brag because there was no need. Every contract was legal and transparent. I never used internal company data and never touched anything related to their operations. I only advised the group using experience and universal principles I had collected over the years. In the morning, Human Resources called me into that room, and the photo they presented captured the exact moment I walked into the Third Point Logistics building. They saw it as proof I was working 2 jobs. I saw it as the funniest piece of evidence they could have chosen. I went to that building to guide the Nebraska group through the new model that my own company had commissioned months earlier. I walked through the lobby, went up to a small conference room on the 6th floor, and spent 2 hours explaining how to read data streams the software could not detect on its own. We flagged 4 risks that leadership at my company would never have imagined, one of which involved the route Declan forgot in his proposal. When I left the building, I simply thought the day's work was done. I never imagined a new security guard would recognize me, and even less that a polite nod in the lobby could turn into the evidence that summoned me to a meeting this morning. If I had told them I was there to save them from the mistakes that they created themselves, they would not have believed me. When a system grows comfortable dismissing anything that does not fit the report, truth becomes the hardest thing to get through the door. I laughed under my breath when I thought back on it. The irony was almost perfect. They hired me through the back door and fired me through the front. If someone had hung a sign with that sentence outside the conference room, the whole morning would have made a lot more sense. What made it even more amusing was that the Nebraska group was still on schedule. Those 6 people were waiting for me to send the final feedback on the model third-point logistics requested, unaware that the only person who had read all the layers of that data had just been pushed out of the company. And in a few days, when the system began to glitch, they would call the group and ask why the model was unstable. The most accurate answer would probably be this: because the one person who knew how to fit the pieces together was fired for walking through the right door at the wrong moment. I knew my old company would soon realize what they lacked. It was not software, funding, or fancy presentations. They lacked someone who understood the system with the eyes of a person who had stood in a cold warehouse at 3 in the morning. Someone who could distinguish whether a data anomaly came from a machine error or from a driver forgetting to scan a code in the snow. Someone who could read a map using lived experience, not assumptions. And what they lacked the most was exactly what they removed this morning. Thinking about that, I started the engine. I was not sad, not angry. I simply saw with full clarity that the game had just shifted. If the morning had been the push that sent me out the old door, then the afternoon might be the first moment when people realized my absence would not be as quiet as they hoped. I turned the car toward the city. I did not need to know who would call first, the company or the Nebraska group. I only knew that what happened today was not the end. It was the first knock in a chain of chaos I had warned them about long ago, and I felt something with absolute certainty. The very evidence they believed they had against me would soon become proof of the opposite. The rhythm they assumed would keep running on its own never could without someone who knows how to hold the beat. And I, whether they accept it or not, have always been that person. I drove back toward the city in a windless afternoon, unhurried. I already knew the system I once kept alive would not last. And just as I expected, less than one full day after I walked out of that building, my old phone began buzzing again and again, but I did not answer. I wanted to let everything reveal itself. I wanted to see how third-point logistics would run when the rhythm they believed could operate on its own no longer had anyone holding it. In the first few hours, the collapse showed up as small signs, the same way an old clock begins to slow a single beat before stopping entirely. In the first 24 hours, the drivers did not receive their route schedules on time. Some received an old schedule from the previous week. Others received 3 overlapping schedules with no priority marked. One driver called the company and was transferred through 4 different extensions before his call was dropped because the operator thought he had dialed the wrong department. In the operations floor, the chaos began like whooping cough, small but persistent, then growing faster and sharper. The route board I used to review every night lay unchecked. The synchronization module I used to adjust manually drifted 5 minutes off, then 15, then 30. Half an hour of deviation was all it took for the chain reaction to begin. At the 30th hour, I received a message from a driver I had known for years. "Mr. Rayner, did your company switch to a new system? Feels like they tossed the map into a ceiling fan and told us to pick up whatever pieces fell." I read it and let out a quiet laugh. Not because I enjoyed any of this, but because sometimes the truth speaks in the simplest voice. By the 48th hour, the picture became clearer. 3 states serviced by third-point logistics were frozen at the same time. Medical equipment shipments did not arrive, leaving 2 hospitals reporting shortages of critical supplies. The people on the front line always feel the blow first. I had once held the entire system together on a blizzard night by rerouting deliveries myself. And now they were struggling while the people inside that glass conference room had no idea why. I did not feel joy, only regret. Regret that my warnings had been filed under reference material instead of urgent priority. By the 60th hour, the Denver Post began reporting. I saw the headline when I stopped by a coffee shop near my home. The front of the business section read, "Medical supply transport faces disruption, multiple hospitals impacted." They did not name the company, but I knew exactly who the story was about. And truth has a way of stepping into the light without being invited. At the 72nd hour, everything locked up completely. The new transition system, the one I had warned them about repeatedly, failed outright. Routes stalled, orders desynchronized. The outsourcing model they believed would cut costs froze the entire supply chain. Through all my years in this line of work, I always knew the system could not last a single day without someone holding the beat. But even I did not expect it to fall apart this quickly. When the supply chain collapsed, the company called an emergency meeting. I was not there, but from what I later heard, I could picture it perfectly. The room was packed. Hadley stood at the head of the table, voice tight as a wire, blaming the IT department for updating the system at the wrong time. He spoke so fast that several people had to ask him to repeat himself. I knew that style too well, trying to make everything sound like a technical glitch instead of a leadership failure. Declan fumbled with his stack of documents, trying to deny hiding one of my warning emails. He claimed he did not remember, that his inbox was overloaded, and that he might have flagged it wrong. But an older board member with sharper eyes brought printed copies to the table and pointed at the notes in my handwriting. The room went silent for several seconds, the kind of silence I had experienced many times when a prediction of mine finally arrived in real time. Then the meeting turned ridiculous, true to its nature. At one point, while people argued about approval workflows, someone asked whether the word logistics was spelled with one letter G or two. When I heard that part, I nearly choked on my coffee. They were debating spelling while shipments across 3 states sat frozen, and hospitals lacked equipment. If it were not so sad, it would have been the funniest moment of the week. A retired security guard called me during his break. He had worked there more than 20 years and understood the entire system better than most executives. He said one sentence that made me stop and stand still. "The day you left, Mr. Rayner, was the day trouble moved in." He laughed, but it was not a happy laugh. I stayed quiet, because I understood the picture perfectly. A system built on the eyes of someone familiar with every small piece of data had been forced to run on models drawn by people who had never stood on a loading dock at 4 in the morning. That 70-second-hour collapse did not happen because I left. It happened because they had never prepared for the moment I might leave. I had warned them. I had written it down. I had presented it, but no one read it. And when truth revealed itself, they panicked about everything except their own mistakes. Standing on my balcony, looking at the western mountains disappearing into the sunset, I felt no satisfaction. I only exhaled. Whether I liked it or not, what happened would affect people who did not deserve the fallout. Drivers, warehouse staff, hospitals, and patients. But a part of me understood this was only the beginning. When a system never learns to stand on its own, it collapses the moment the hand holding its rhythm steps away. And this was only the first 72 hours. The story was far from over. And I knew they would reach out to me soon, not because they wanted to, but because they no longer had any other choice. 3 days after the system at Third Point Logistics began collapsing piece by piece, I left Denver. Not to run, I simply realized there was no reason to stand near a house that was already falling apart just to remind people I once told them to fix the roof. I packed a few things from my small apartment, slipped my father's pocket watch into my coat, and drove north toward Minnesota, where an unadorned invitation was waiting. A nonprofit medical organization up north had worked with me during the flu season in 2014. Back then, their distribution network was nearly gridlocked, and I spent 3 days in a temporary room rerouting their deliveries. Maybe that was why last week they reached out so quickly. The director's voice was calm, steady as a Minnesota lake. "We need someone who understands how a real system works, not someone who reads from slides. If you want a place to start over, we are ready." Their office sat in the middle of a pine forest, humble enough that someone might mistake it for a small community center. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew I had left the old world behind. No one looked at me like a man who had just lost his job. No measured glances, no overly formal greetings. They welcomed me simply and gently, as if I had arrived at the exact moment they needed me, and they at the exact moment I needed to breathe. The first meeting had only 4 people. No projector, no cluttered charts, just a paper map spread across a wooden table. Looking at it made me think of the nights my father sat in the kitchen with the map on the table, showing me the routes he had taken, the hills he avoided, the winter bridges he said were never safe with a heavy truck. The memory was so vivid I almost heard the faint ticking of his pocket watch under my coat. One of the younger members turned the map toward me. She could not have been older than 30, sharp, and a little shy. She asked in an honest, unpolished voice, "Can you show us how someone with real experience reads a transport map? Not the way software breaks it down, but the way someone who has actually worked in the field sees it." I did not answer right away. I looked at the map, then at the faces around the table. They were all waiting, not trying to outtalk each other, not trying to prove anything. They simply wanted to understand. Something so simple, yet something I had not seen at a workplace in many years. I started with the smallest details. I showed them how to see a main road as a river and the branches as underground streams. I talked about seasonal delays, terrain shifts, and how one missing line of data in a report could reveal the real bottleneck. They took notes nonstop, never interrupting, never pretending they already knew. Their focus made me feel like I had stepped into a new land, a place where experience was not treated as an obstacle, but as a map for the road ahead. After the meeting, they walked me to a small simulation warehouse behind the office. They used it to practice real-world scenarios, labeled crates, mock routes, and incident drills. A small space but full of purpose, unlike the cold glass rooms back in Denver. Here, everything felt alive, grounded, human. One young man stood beside me as we watched a simulation run. He asked a question so soft it almost blended with the breeze. "Do you feel sad that they did not listen to you?" I thought for a moment before answering. They did not listen because I was wrong. They did not listen because truth makes people uncomfortable. He nodded, simple as that. But that small nod made me realize that for the first time in years, someone actually understood what I meant. We continued practicing. I let them handle a few scenarios on their own, then pointed out adjustments. No one treated my feedback as criticism. No one tried to hide their mistakes. They looked at the problem, not at their pride. That alone warmed me more than any praise I ever received at the old company. The moment that stayed with me happened late in the afternoon. As we were rearranging boxes on the shelf, a young woman from the group spoke quietly, almost like a whisper, but with complete sincerity. "We are lucky to have you here." The words were not grand or dramatic, but they reached me in a way I did not expect. I never needed admiration. I just never thought I would hear something like that again in this line of work. When we stepped out of the simulation warehouse, the Minnesota wind had picked up, carrying the sharp smell of pine. I stopped and watched the trees sway, then slipped my hand into my pocket, touching my father's watch. The ticking in my memory reminded me that sometimes the right choice is not staying somewhere, waiting for recognition, but walking toward the place that recognized your worth from the start. That evening, as I left the office, I felt the same lightness as the first time I took off a heavy pack after a long march. Not because I escaped the punch, but because I had stepped into a place where I still mattered, still belonged, still had a role in something that needed me. For the first time in a very long while, I felt I was no longer standing alone against a system. I had a team, a place that truly listened, and that alone was enough to tell me my new chapter was finally starting in the right direction. I was showing the young team how to recalibrate a transport route when my phone began buzzing. Once, twice, then nonstop, hard enough that the desk rattled. I left it in the drawer. The people who needed me were no longer in Denver, and I had no reason to run back to a group that only remembered my name when their pipes started leaking. But when the screen lit up for the 32nd time, I knew something had moved beyond the point they could fix on their own. I took the phone, sat down on a wooden chair by the window, and opened the list of missed calls. The old company number, the Denver Post, the legal office, a string of unfamiliar numbers. I returned the Denver Post call first. The reporter spoke fast, with a hint of excitement I never thought anyone in logistics could inspire. "Mr. Rayner, are you aware that you are the hottest name in the industry right now?" I looked at the pocket watch in my hand. "I am guessing they are in trouble." He laughed. "Trouble is putting it lightly. Their distribution network is frozen. 3 states are short on medical supplies. 2 contractors just cut ties. Their stock dropped 30%. Rumor says they are trying to reach you in any way they can." I did not answer, not because I felt pleased, just because everything was falling exactly the way it was always going to fall. I did not push it. They walked themselves straight into it. The next call came from the old finance department. His voice was low, almost a whisper, like someone terrified another person might be standing behind him. Thomas, please, can you help us? In any form. Remote consulting, part-time, full-time, whatever it takes. Just help stop the chain reaction before the board loses its mind. I did not speak right away. I let a few seconds pass, long enough for him to feel the weight of the silence. Finally, I said, I can help, but I have conditions. I picked up a pen. My voice was steady, the same tone I used when reading an inventory checklist. 1. A public apology. Clear, direct, no softening it, no calling it a misunderstanding. 2. Restore the operations department to the structure I proposed 3 years ago. Fully staffed, fully equipped, no cuts. 3. Compensate every employee harmed by this failure. I do not care where you get the money. 4. I work remotely. I am not stepping back into that building. No badges, no in-person meetings. I send instructions, they execute. He went silent. I could hear his breath tighten. I will pass your terms along. But Hadley wants to sue you. He claims you sabotaged the company. I let out a very faint laugh. He can file whatever he wants. Every warning email carries a timestamp and a digital signature. The problem is, they never read any of them. Later that afternoon, the head of the nonprofit walked over. He placed a hand on the table, light and steady, as if asking whether I was all right. They called you again, did they? I suppose they will keep calling. He gestured toward an empty meeting room. If you want to return their calls, use this space. Here, we believe people have the right to choose how they work. His voice carried a quiet dignity, something I had not received from leadership in 3 decades. I called back. This time it was a board member. Her voice was drawn tight, stretched thin. Mr. Rayner, we need your help, but your conditions are firm. I only ask for what is required to keep your system operating at the minimum level of safety. She started to speak again, but chaos erupted behind her from the large conference room. A familiar voice, Hadley, shouting, "We are not agreeing to his conditions. He caused this. Sue him." Another voice cut in, sharper. "Hadley, stop. How many of Rayner's warning emails did you hide? Why are they missing from the reports?" Papers hit the table. Chairs scraped. I heard Declan, his voice trembling like a string about to snap. I thought those emails were not necessary yet. Thought, a woman's voice snapped back. You thought our entire system is collapsing because of your thinking. Then Hadley yelled again. This is all his fault. Another voice shot back instantly. No, the system collapsed in the exact order of his warnings. The fault lies with the people who ignored them. I listened quietly without emotion. No joy, no anger, just clarity, like watching water return to the riverbed it always belonged to. Eventually the chaos faded. The board member returned to the line. Her voice was low, tired, and resolved. Mr. Rayner, we accept all of your conditions. I looked out the window at the Minnesota pines standing still in the cold air. Good. When the company publishes the apology and sends the initial payment, I will send the recovery process. Someone in the background whispered, barely audible but unmistakably clear. If only we had listened to him 3 years ago. I ended the call. No smile, no relief. I simply set the phone on the table. The way you return a familiar object to its rightful place. Hadley wants to sue me. Let him. Declan is panicking. Naturally, the board is unraveling. Consequence, not surprise. I do not have to do anything. The truth is exposing itself, cold and precise, the way a transport map never lies. I walked back into the small workspace of the nonprofit. The young team waited for me to review their simulation. They smiled when I returned. And I understood something with complete clarity. I no longer belonged to the chaos in Denver. I was simply closing the last page of a chapter already finished. In the next chapter, I will write on my own terms, without asking permission, without swallowing anything, and without ever looking back. Ever. I received the advance transfer and the public apology the next morning. A long, polished document, cleaner and more carefully worded than anything they had sent me in 30 years. I read it and simply nodded, not pleased and not angry. It only confirmed one thing. They had run out of exits. 10 minutes later, the meeting link appeared on my screen. Thomas Rayner, emergency advisor. I turned on the webcam inside the small conference room of the nonprofit. The Minnesota light through the window was cold enough to keep me sharp, gentle enough not to wash out the strained faces on the other end of the call. The meeting opened with 13 faces. Most of them looked like they had gone through 2 nights without sleep. Hadley was the only one missing. I assumed he was busy finding someone to blame or shouting into the phone at whatever lawyer still picked up his calls. Either way, it did not matter to me. I did not make small talk, did not ask how anyone was doing, did not open with pleasantries. I said, my voice straight as a line drawn across a map. I shared my screen. On it was the system diagram I rebuilt from memory and a few old reports. No one objected. No one interrupted. They knew exactly where they stood. First, I said, you need to stop trying to restart the entire system at once. This setup cannot survive panic-driven fixes. Strip it down layer by layer and deal with each point of failure. One engineer nodded rapidly. Another looked one breath away from crying out of relief. I continued. Open your support panel. Find the weekly load overlap tab. I spelled this out clearly in last year's guidelines. The issue is that you preferred looking at green numbers instead of gray realities. No one answered, but a few faces flushed. Not because I was harsh, because they knew every word was true. I walked them through restoring the authentication layer first. It had always been the weak point. I had said that for 3 years, but they liked calling it temporarily stable. Temporary had become permanent. Now, I said, we move to the data relay. Do not touch the backup port. Leave it as it is. That is the only piece still breathing. Someone rushed to speak. But we thought, I know what you thought, I cut in. And that line of thinking is exactly how you ended up here. Do as I say. My voice was not raised, not rushed, not angry, just sharp, like a newly sharpened blade. Few words, each one landing where it needed to. Step by step, layer by layer, I guided them through the structure I had once held together with a team that had been cut down until only I remained. Authentication revived first, then the data relay, then the status grid, reassembling the bones of a body that had already collapsed. After a while, I heard someone exhale hard. Mr. Rayner, the signal is stabilizing. Good, I said, but do not celebrate. This system is like someone recovering from hypothermia. You warm it slowly. They followed instructions, silent, focused, no objections, no theories. For the first time in years, they did exactly what they should have done long ago. They listened. When the last route cleared, the status board shifted to yellow, then pale green. I saw a few heads drop, like people stepping away from the edge of something dangerous. Another person covered their face. Perhaps they had just realized how preventable this all was if they had read the warnings. Someone whispered, if we had read those emails earlier. I answered immediately, do not say that to me. Say it to the hospitals waiting for their supplies. The room fell silent, not because I wanted to shame them, because it was the only truth that mattered. The system kept recovering, from near total freeze to monitored functionality. The colors shifting on the board did not bring me joy or satisfaction. They only confirmed one thing. The order was returning to where it belonged. Someone from operations asked cautiously, are you doing this for us or for... I am doing this for the patients, I said. The people waiting for equipment should not suffer because of your leadership mistakes. No one replied. They understood. And for the first time, their shame landed in the right place. The call lasted almost 4 hours. When everything stabilized enough to stand on its own, I ended with one final line. From now on, read every line I send. I will not fix the same mistake twice. I turned off the webcam. The room slipped back into the quiet of Minnesota. Outside the window, light snow had begun to fall. No yelling, no frantic footsteps like in the Denver boardroom. Only wind and cold are settling into the air. I stood and walked down the hallway toward the simulation warehouse. The young team was working, and when they saw me, they greeted me naturally, as if I had not just pulled a billion-dollar system back onto its feet. One young woman asked, you all right? I nodded, fine, and finished. The young man from earlier looked at me with a slight smile. You really saved them, huh? I replied. I saved my profession, not them. And that was the clearest truth. I did not return because they deserved it. I returned because there are innocent people at the end of every route. I did what I was taught by my father. The mission gets done. Trust is a different matter. Outside, the snow melted into small drops on my coat. I looked up at the gray sky and realized I felt no heaviness, no bitterness, no need to prove anything. I had done my part, and they were finally beginning to understand the value of what they once ignored. And with that, the last chapter before the future closed exactly where it needed to. 3 days after the recovery call, just when I thought I could stay quiet for a moment, the director of the nonprofit stepped into the simulation warehouse where I was guiding the young team through load analysis. He handed me an envelope stamped in red by the Department of Health and placed it on the table. You should look at this. I opened the envelope. Inside was an invitation to join the National Medical Equipment Distribution Program, a project aimed at rebuilding the entire emergency transport network of the United States. Direct, unadorned, they wanted me on the central strategy team. I finished reading and said only, they took longer than I expected to realize it. The director chuckled softly. Maybe people only understand the importance of logistics when the thing they rely on starts to break. I folded the letter, not because I was moved, because everything was shifting back to where it belonged. Not the place I once asked for, but the place I had earned. Later in the afternoon, as I was preparing to leave the office, the receptionist handed me a blue envelope with a handwritten address. I opened it right there in the lobby, a letter from a rural hospital in North Dakota. Only a few lines, clear and direct. Because of the route you designed last week, surgical equipment arrived in time for an emergency operation on a 7-year-old boy. 30 minutes later, and he would not have survived. Thank you. I folded the letter. It was not the kind of gratitude that makes a person emotional. It was colder, sharper, a precise confirmation. The system worked, a life was kept, nothing more needed. I slipped the letter into my coat pocket beside my father's watch. He once told me, in this field you do not save the world. You just make sure the supplies do not arrive late. Today the words came back with perfect clarity. The next day, the communications team told me I had been mentioned at a major industry conference. A national forum had used my case with Third Point Logistics to open a session titled Why Medical Logistics Keeps Suffering Workforce Collapse. I watched the excerpt. Thomas Rayner is the clearest example of the industry's long-standing disregard for seasoned experience, a systemic failure across the entire field. I felt nothing. It was not praise. It was a diagnosis, and it was accurate. Then the emails began arriving, not from people who lived at the front of the industry, but from people like me. Long-haul drivers, night shift warehouse workers, overnight coordinators, people who understood the system better than the managers trying to run it. I was kept out of meetings because they said I was too old. Thank you for proving that experience is not obsolete. I see myself in your story. I read each message without needing to reply. The writers did not need answers. They only needed someone to prove that the way they had been treated was not normal. Early the following week, the Denver Post ran a long article about the collapse of Third Point Logistics. The illustration was not a gridlocked warehouse. It was me, standing over a paper map, pointing at a route. The article called me a new voice for the overlooked older workforce. I did not care for the phrase new voice. It sounded like a slogan, but I understood what they meant. The industry had finally begun looking back at its foundations, and my old company. They appeared in 3 major conferences under one category: case study on failure caused by the dismissal of core expertise. One presentation laid out every step of how they had ignored warnings, cut crucial staff, relied on hollow models, and eventually brought down the system they believed was optimized. One slide was particularly blunt. When you fire the only person who knows the path, do not wonder why the convoy loses its way. My name was not printed on it. It did not need to be. Anyone in the field knew exactly who it referred to. That afternoon, an old colleague sent me a photo of the conference screen. The slide, the silent room, the presenter standing still as he walked the audience through the collapse. I replied, good. I hope they understand. I was not bitter, not triumphant. I only felt clarity. The field was shifting back to its proper orbit, no longer treating experience as excess, no longer believing software alone would save them. The people behind the roots, the ones pushed into the shadows because they did not present well on slides, were finally being seen again. And me. I did not feel like someone rising. I only felt like someone returning to his role, the one who knows how to keep a system alive. I did not need applause. I did not need a spotlight. Only one thing mattered. People had started listening, not because I spoke loudly, but because the system collapsed loudly enough for them to understand they could not ignore people like me anymore. A name rises not through noise, but through the stability an entire industry is forced to seek again. And that, for me, was enough. Work in Minnesota settled into a steady rhythm once the National Medical Distribution Program entered its trial phase. I spent most of my days in the simulation warehouse, supervising data and teaching the young team how to fine-tune each route. Everything moved quietly, smooth as a spring lake, until one morning my phone lit up with a notification from the executive board of Third Point Logistics. I knew why they were calling, but I still let 2 calls pass before answering the third. "Mr. Rayner," the voice on the other end said, trying to keep steady, "the board would like to bring you back as a senior advisor. We are restructuring the entire system. We need you." Once, years ago, that sentence might have unsettled me. Now it was just noise passing through the air. I answered, "I am in a place that values decency, and that place is not yours." Silence lingered long enough for them to grasp the response they should have expected from the beginning. "I understand," the woman said softly. "Even so, thank you for stabilizing the system during the crisis." "That was a duty to the patients," I said, "not to the company." I hung up and set the phone down. A chapter had truly closed. Later that day, a former colleague sent a short email. "Hadley has been fired. Declan was reassigned to a local warehouse. The board is treating your warning emails as the new restructuring guideline." I read it without satisfaction. They were only paying the price for the choices they made themselves. I did not need any further confirmation. Back in the control room, the young team was reviewing route load data. They showed me an updated map of the eastern region and asked about a small discrepancy the software had missed. I pointed to the corner of the map. "Here, the issue is not inside the system. It is in how you read it. Wind shifts this season. That route needs adjusting." They noted it immediately, without doubt or debate. A young woman asked, "Do you ever feel regret about leaving your old company?" No, I did not leave anything that held value for me. They did not ask more. They just smiled and went on with their work. In that moment, I understood the biggest difference between the two places. Here, I did not have to prove myself. Here, knowledge was not treated as outdated. A few days later, an industry journal ran a long feature on the National Distribution Program, describing me as the architect reshaping how life-saving equipment moves. In the same issue, Third Point Logistics appeared under the section on lessons in core workforce mismanagement. A colleague sent me a photo from a major conference. On stage, a slide filled the screen with the title, "Do not fire the one who knows the way." I read it and simply nodded, not out of joy, but because the industry had finally learned the bare minimum. As the national routes shifted from yellow to green, I stood in the simulation warehouse, watching the status lights change. No applause, no slogans, just a quiet signal that somewhere in a small hospital, an emergency center, a remote town, the right equipment would arrive on time. One of the young team members said, "You just changed how the whole field looks at logistics." I answered, "I just did my job. I did not need to be called a hero. I only needed to know that none of the routes I built would make someone wait another minute." That evening, sitting on the bench behind the warehouse, I finally understood what mattered most in this entire story. It was not their collapse. It was not who got fired. What mattered was this: I stepped away from a place that did not respect me and walked into one that needed exactly what I knew. I once thought revenge meant watching those who underestimated me face consequences. But standing in Minnesota, in the cold wind and the soft end of day, I found the truer definition. Revenge is not watching them fail. Revenge is succeeding in a place they will never reach. My old company may track every move I make. They may see my name in the papers, on the forums, in the national project. But they cannot touch the life I am living now. A life without proving myself, without swallowing frustration, without sitting in rooms where arrogance drowned out knowledge. I looked at my new team, young people who listened, learned, and respected the one standing before them. Here I saw the future of the field, not written on slides, but standing firmly under the warehouse lights. And I understood, justice does not always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet footsteps of someone leaving what is unworthy and building something better elsewhere. If this story reminds you of someone who was undervalued, leave a comment. And if you want more stories about quiet justice and the persistence of ordinary people, subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter. Silence is sometimes the loudest victory of all.